just going back to the beginning with talking about Avis, and I've got a lot of quite similar questions have come through about Avis's plans, if you've got any plans for ride sharing. Will you be the Airbnb of cars? And that the demarcation between taxi, rideshare, rentals, even car makers blur with the arrival of the autonomous car. What will Avis become, and what player will emerge?
Yeah, great question. So we've spent a couple of years actually developing a strategy and a plan on this subject and topic. So clearly our industry will change and go through a dramatic change over the next couple of years. We've already begun, several years ago, we began down this journey by purchasing Zipcar to try and understand the sharing economy, how people will share rides, share cars, and what that means in our ecosystem. We also know that in the world of autonomous cars that somebody needs to operate autonomous cars. So there's a lot of companies focused on building them, but there is the customer journey, understanding the customer journey, as well as managing the car, the fleet, et cetera. So we believe we're well poised to be a leader in that space. So we will continue to move down a path to incorporate fleet management as a service, travel as a service, making sure the customer journey and customers get used to all the advancements in transportation between now and full autonomous.
Fantastic. When you outlined some of those images of rethinking both our airports, our curbs, what the streets look like, it sort of leads into one of the questions here we've got. Are we currently building what will be stranded infrastructure in 5 to 10 years? And is a 40-year plan for transport, is it overkill? Is it possible? How do we balance knowing that we need to change, but also artificially possibly planning for the future? And maybe if I can pass that to you, Kate.
Sure. As I mentioned, planning for a 40-year horizon has its limitations in terms of certainty of outcomes. But we think it's really important that with the data that we have and the being proactive and shaping cities for the future, that we have to look long term. When we're previously planning in short terms, we've discovered that perhaps outcomes aren't always as best as they could be. So planning for 40 years allows us to make some broader, bolder, visionary aspirations and outcomes. What we're going to put out is drafts, but what we're really seeking is that deep and detailed feedback from, as I said, all sectors of the community and industry around what's important to them in that planning.
I just wanted to jump in there. I think that's an excellent question, and I'm really afraid and concerned that policies and plans are set, and infrastructure builds are set in 10-year, 20-year, 30-year plans, and we built $25 billion into railway infrastructure to connect the Western Sydney airport, whereas in 25 years we might not need that mode of transportation anymore. So I don't have the answer, but all I'm saying is it's an excellent question which warrants serious consideration if you think about the numbers that we're talking about, right? Hundreds of billions of dollars going into infrastructure, but we could test a Lilium type service for less than $10 million and have a test bed in Western Sydney and see whether there's some adoption. So I think that this magnitude of investment versus what technology makes possible, we need to buy this optionality, and smart cities buy the optionality. So you have Dubai and others that buy the optionalities through experimentation, and so we need to get better at that.
Yeah, the sort of planning, procurement, implementation cycle that Chirayu outlined is all about make it big, but it's not iterative at all. So you had a comment, Scott.
Yeah, it's kind of a cliched entrepreneur's response. If you asked people what they wanted, they'd say faster horses. Right? So I'm sure that's been taken into account.
Hence the picture up there earlier.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. The faster horses, I missed that one. But anyway, joke. there's an over-intellectualized word, ontological design, right? So as you design the world, it designs you back. So perhaps, and I love your graphics and I love the story and approaches and so on, but it's interesting also to think about this question as about not necessarily what modes and so on, but what do we want? How do we want people to feel? How do we want them to be able to connect, not only just in consideration of human to human, but as humans, we're animals, we're actually part of the environment as well. So from the environmental consideration, more heavily.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Scott, with that, one of the questions we have here is around how AR, VR responds. And if we did sort of have a more virtual connection with people, how does that work for people? That is it a good fit across a typical current working day, given that some people can feel disoriented over longer use? Have you thought about just what are the most likely use cases given for the AR, VR and the hologram that you're wanting to introduce?
Well, I also get disoriented after a bit of traffic congestion and so on as well, you know. But the serious answer on that is the technology's improved. And just as you saw on my slide with the measuring tape, to be accurate more or less to the millimetre, in the past that hasn't been possible, and this is the big breakthrough. And so it's important as you turn your head that the graphics are keeping up with you as they would naturally, integrated with the world, so whether it's virtual reality or augmented reality. So whilst at this time, you know, with Google Cardboard and Samsung Gear and to an extent Oculus Rift, you get 1% to 3% of people affected. With the higher end gear, which will kind of come downstream to everything else over the next 12, 24 months, there's almost 0% sickness, motion sickness. And then after all, also, there are people that just kind of get car sick or boat sick just from moving around anyway. So these factors definitely have been considered.
Yeah, it reminds me of the sort of the incredible intellectual property that is going into the technologies that you're using and you're building, and I guess really thinking about that and some of the things you look at as an investor with all these IoT startups with competing ideas and innovations. What is the role impact of intellectual property laws? And how do you assess that when you're looking at investing in startups? How do you assess how ready they are to protect their IP?
So I think purely from an intellectual property ownership standpoint, I think the way we look at it is what's the lead that the company has over its competitors. And if that lead is of a certain number of months, we think that's enough of a runway for them to actually stay ahead. And perhaps, you know, have financial outcomes like an acquisition. But that alone typically never gets you there. You have other effects like network effects that are a much more sort of comprehensive moat around the usage of the technology by users, and then creating sort of this demand side pull. So I would say that it's not purely how deep is the intellectual property to protect you. It is how you've used that to get the users on your side, and therefore they cannot leave the platform. Yeah. So one example would be that if you're using a service, and you're using a service because there's enough of drivers out there that are offering you that service, you're not going to leave that service for another one that may have high wait times, right? So even if your intellectual property may not be there, you've gotten something that's sticky. So it's complex, but intellectual property is not the only answer.
Very helpful. And I think there's a question on all of our minds, and it's for you, Hanno, around when will the Lilium be available on the market?
Okay. Excellent. I think they're looking for MDs in Asia. So the fascinating bit here is Lilium is an example is a stimulus example, right? So Lilium can do this within 3 to 4 years and get a prototype up and running and have a solid test bed. Just imagine what you can do, right? And it might be Lilium, it might be called different, but within less than 5 years, you can actually really have an impact on how we think about transportation of the future. So taking Lilium now as more specifically, there are at least 20 flying saucers starting up at the moment, right? And they're backed by Google, by Uber, by many, many heavyweight companies. So also traditional companies, industrial companies, GE and so on, they're all getting into this. So lots of capital there. Interestingly enough, no car company has yet invested into Uber, I would say, is the closest investing into flying saucers. So money is there, so there's the belief that it will happen. And we can actually take it as a fact that one mode of transport will be an electric plane of some sort. The next question then becomes, and I think that's much more interesting for Australian entrepreneurs, is how can we enable the infrastructure around it, right? And I think that's fascinating. So what do we do with our garage, right? How do we wire up our garage? How do we actually think about the security layer on top of it? Do we have the right data in Australia to enable the same type of transportation that we can do, that Uber will deploy in San Francisco? So Lilium will launch in Dubai and in Singapore and in San Francisco for a reason, because the data layer is at 2 centimeters. So all of the LiDAR data, all of the detailed infrastructure data is available. But Lilium cannot launch in Australia because the government plus private sectors, we have not digitized our infrastructure. So that's fascinating. So it's not just the flying device, but it's the whole infrastructure around it.
The enablers of bringing it to market need to be there as well. Kaye, as we think about technology and the development of technology and the different user experience, we touched a lot on, the different speakers touched a lot on the user experience. Are we building for the diversity of the end users, and what are you seeing in the sort of technology and the type of people that are developing the technology that we're going to use in the future?
So we talked about this a little earlier, and so I've been self-reflecting on my Zipcar days and where Zipcar came from. And Zipcar actually started with the end in mind, right, with the goal in mind. And actually, from day one through today, still brings in customers, members, I should say, from within the community to help develop the new advancements. So whether it's developing a new technology, developing new app, developing new functionality, which there are many different types of car share. And so we engage the customer in a very, very deep level. That's number one. So I see that continuing to happen. And so you may have, some companies may think they need developers. We actually think to improve technology, we actually start with a customer in mind and hire experts who can watch behavior of the customer interact with the iterations of our either technology or the car we put them in or how they interact with us. 16 years ago, people laughed. Car manufacturers laughed at Zipcar for having this notion we call car share. And because we started with the customer, the adoption grew over time, and you see what happens today. We're taking that approach and we're applying it to our experience and the things we develop at Avis now. And so we are engaged with user groups as we develop new experiences with Avis and the technology that we deploy.
Fantastic. I guess a question here for you, Chirayu, about, and there's actually a similar question for yourself, Hanno, about data ownership and control. So what do you see as smart ways to facilitate data ownership and control? Who owns it? And you spoke a little bit about the dichotomy between privacy and security. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
So that's an interesting one, and something that's very close to our hearts in Singapore. I was on a panel at the Interpol, and this was one of the scenarios that was painted, that in the future when an autonomous vehicle actually goes through an accident, what will it take from a forensic standpoint to prove that the vehicle wasn't commandeered by someone else from the outside to cause an accident? And honestly, the amount of data that we've been seeing that's been generated out of these vehicles is extremely is much higher than what we've ever seen before. So it is a problem that we are looking at from a perspective of data ownership and security of the device. So one piece of it is the vehicle secure enough, and who controls that security? And the other one is all the data that's generated, and if it's going to be a shared economy model where it's a company that owns the data, what level of data should we think about that can be shared? So is there data that is fundamentally unshareable, which is my daily sort of trip history, or is there data which is kind of shareable, which may be used in an aggregated way that is completely okay and that may help actually subsidize my ride, for example. But giving the control to the user is at the center of it, and giving that optionality without actually going through 30 lines or 30 pages of TNC is sort of where we will head. In fact, one of the things that we could consider is sort of a user experience where users can pick the level of data sharing they want to do, and then the price of the service could be set on the basis of that, right? So we could get into that, but that's where it's something it's an area that's very close to our hearts, and we're kind of spending a lot of time thinking about how that model would evolve in the future.
I think that this is such a difficult question, but at the same time, a central puzzle piece to make IoT and the future of transportation work. So let me have a stab at it. And what you've done with 2056 for modes of transport and how consumers and every one of us lives in a livable city, I think we need to do the same exercise with how we think about data to live in the future and where government comes in. So the point earlier about LiDAR data. So some of you might know LiDAR data. It's highly accurate data. You've seen the Google cars go around the city, mapping the city. Microsoft is doing the same, and 20 other companies are doing the same. Highly accurate, down to the millimeter, to map our cities. Now, these are private enterprises, right? Enabling autonomous vehicles to get around and navigate around our cities. The issue with that is, firstly, they are data platforms, so is this okay? I have not seen a single position of the UN or the city of Sydney or the city of Singapore to talk about, is it right to take that data into private enterprise? And then you can spin that further and say, okay, the data that comes out of my car, and we had this example before, why should it belong actually to the individual? We want to enable a new mode of transport. So a smart government could say, all of that data needs to be public, shared, so that we all can talk to each other. It needs to be transparent so that we can actually enable those new modes of transport so that we don't have traffic accidents. So those are all really difficult discussions, ethical discussions. At the World Economic Forum, we discussed many of those implications then as well. But we need to dissect all of the different data layers and then say, where does it belong to a government, or where should we legislate and make it public, shareable, free, so that we are safer in the future versus what's really private?
I think it leads on to a question for yourself there, Kate, around New South Wales' position on opening data and transport particularly. Is there a position there? And I to paraphrase the question, why not open your data and let others work with it to expedite the process? And I understand there is a full policy around opening data. What's been your position on that, and how does it tie into designing the future of the built environment?
Sure. I think Hanno makes a really great point, is that sharing data, and whether it's governments or private sectors, it raises a plethora of ethical issues and a plethora of security issues. And I read an article last week around changing perceptions of customers, and Uber's the perfect example. And to your slide, Scott, that talked about loyalty and trust, when we hop into an Uber vehicle, we have the option of sharing our ride with someone. But when we hop into an Uber vehicle, we're doing something that when we were being raised and growing up that we didn't do before. And that's hopping into a vehicle with a stranger that isn't necessarily has gone through the same rigor as a taxi driver that is traditionally regulated. And I think that's such a fascinating concept around trust, because it means that as consumers and customers, our perception of trust and safety has completely fundamentally shifted. And I think the same discussion at an esoteric level could be had of sharing open source data. And that is, do we feel safer sharing the massive amounts of data, or does that in of itself create a further risk? And that's an esoteric and ethical dilemma that we could be here for hours.
Is it, there's a line between ethics and people really, is it generational where the younger generation, quite frankly, doesn't care as much as other generations that data is shared as long as there's a benefit to them?
I'm thankful every day I did not grow up with Facebook.
Yeah. That's number one. And number two, when data is aggregated, and usually, typically you need aggregated data to make the advancements we need to make. So if data is aggregated, then you're not getting to PII, personal information, where you can track it down to a person. So, I know there's a lot of, smarter people than me thinking about this, but there are places where we can start to share data and should start to share data to make advancements in this.
Absolutely.
Yes,
I think in kudos to the state government, actually, once upon a time you asked for freedom of information, and now there's a thing called GIPA, isn't there not? GIPA, yes, standing for?
Government Information Privacy
Correct.
Act.
Yeah, so there has been a shift.
Well, I think you're perhaps conflating some issues there. We're talking about open source data. But for example, the Future Transport project is a perfect example of where cross-government departments, which traditionally hasn't always shared data, are sharing data for the benefit of an outcome, and what is a fantastic outcome. And I think that's true of lots of governments, not unique just to Australia or particularly New South Wales. We have Department of Planning, we have Transport, we have Health, we have Treasury and Finance. Like we've been genuinely sharing and opening our books, if you will, sharing data to better make informed decisions across government, which is refreshing.
And leading to better outcomes, as we're already seeing with some of the Western Sydney plans.
Well, which goes to Hanno's point earlier around planning for such a long period of time, and that's the shift we've had in terms of planning outcomes for customers, as opposed to being mode specific necessarily, looking at what outcomes people want, as opposed to, do I want to catch a red bus there or a plane there or a train there, being being more mode agnostic and looking at customer outcomes.
Great. We've got a question in the audience.
And just a little quick one. To your point of Facebook, the person that invented the like button has banned themselves from Facebook now.
I'm still getting a few on the email, so we can go through Slido as well. I guess I wanted to come back to that issue of procurement. We've talked about sort of sharing of data. We've talked about some of the light touch regulation and the approaches Singapore's taken, but implementation can be stopped, and particularly when you were talking, Hanno, about project management and how you plan big and then you've sort of got to step back from that when technology changes. Procurement is a topic we come back to a lot. Chirayu, can you elaborate a little bit on what Singapore's doing there and making it easier for startups to engage in the procurement process, but also about the flexibility of the tendering process itself?
So I think the one that I sort of mentioned there was something that's called the Green Channel.
It's called the what?
It's called the Green Channel, and it is for small companies that ordinarily would not be able to qualify under the RFP or the tendering process, given the size of the balance sheet and everything else, that get an alternate opportunity to actually go through this process. And startups go through a 3 to 4 month diligence where they go through sort of a very, very thorough vetting exercise, not just at a commercial level, but also at the technical and security level, where the stuff they're building is tested against existing sort of deployments, trial deployments. And at the end of that, if you have green channel, you basically are then not required to go through a tendering process, and they can buy from you directly. So that's been, more or less been implemented, and we have one startup that we know that's gone through the process. We have another startup in our portfolio that's in the process. And this is not just true of, for example, around smart cities, but even financial data, for example. We have some startups that are dealing with financial data that belongs to the government, and the startup was asked to go through this process. So yes, it's an investment for the startup, but they realize that they won't have to participate in an open tender that would sort of create its own consequences. So hopefully that answers the question.
Absolutely. Kate, I know it's a topic you spoke about almost 5 years ago, about sort of the sustainable procurement. Coming into transport from that private sector background, what are you seeing in the public sector, and what can we learn? What are some of the tips that you would pass on to any of us that are participating in procurement processes?
Yeah, sure. I guess I'd start with the framework or the basics of, procurement processes are in place to have integrity in the process and to have the proper checks and balances. But I think as a general comment, certainly, and this is something that Tony is really passionate about, is working closely with the private sector on partnering and getting rid of the red tape, making things more efficient and effective, and while still having the rigor and robust framework around the integrity of the process, being a little bit more, dare I say, agile in terms of procurement. But to your point earlier, and we were having this discussion about one of the most common questions I get asked from the private sector now is, how can we make our tender, how do we differentiate our tender, or how do we, get the winning advantage? And my answer is always the same, and that is something very simple, and is when you are putting a team together for a project, make sure that that team is as diverse as the community for which you are planning the strategy or the infrastructure or the outcome. Because too often we see homogeny in ideas or in the people within a team. And my comment would be, and this is so true of future transport, we have a very multidisciplinary team of not just engineers or planners or demographers or economists. We have people who are, have previously been gamers or write code or are comms specialists or have a very diverse range of experiences. And for me, the most important part of a truly innovative project team is cognitive diversity. Not diversity for diversity's sake, whether it's the female or male or background or religion or whatever it might be. Cognitive diversity of a team is absolutely paramount.
Wow, well that's a really fantastic point to end on. Join me in thanking the panel again. Thank you all for your presentation.